This is Gemara Basra Daf Kof Mem Beis, and today's shir has been dedicated as an incredible schos, Aliyat Neshama for Aliyahu ben Mattisyahu. His yahrzeit is at the end of this week. I believe it is on the day of this daf, B'siyata D'Shemaya. The schos HaTorah should bring Aliyahu ben Mattisyahu higher and higher in Gan Eden Shalmayla, closer to the Kisei HaKavod, and of course, be a Milat Yosher for the entire mishpacha, as well as the learning should be an incredible zchos refuah shalema for Tinoik ben Miriam Ahuva b'siyato d'shmaya. We're on the top of Kuf Mem Beis Amud Aleph. We're middle of a discussion exactly between Rav Huna and Rav Nachman. What happens? At what point is this child having a kinyan on the Yerusha, etc.? So we're 3 lines from the top, and we're middle of discussion. Rav Huna responds, Rav Huna, Avlach Sheteleid Laikana. If someone says that we're trying to figure out how to give something to the fetus, to the uber, and of course this goes down to the fundamental shayla of how can you give something over to someone who is not alive. So says the Gemara, Rav Huna holds av licha sheteled. If someone says licha sheteled when the mother gives birth, lo ikana. So to Amar Rav Nachman, and now we get to find out this conversation between Rav Nachman and Rav Huna. Hamizakel obar lo ikana. If someone is mizakeh, if someone tries to give over something to the ober, it's a schos. You're giving over a gift, you're giving over an item to the ober, lo ikana. But says Rav Nachman, licha sheteled. But if someone says when the ober is born, then kana. There is a kinyan. So Rav Huna omer aflach sheteled lo ikana. Whereas Rav Huna says no. Even if you say licha sheteled when the baby is born, there's still no kinyan. Rav Sheshes amar echad zeh v'echad zeh kana. So we have a 3-way machlokes how a mezakeh la'ober works. We have the extreme of Rav Sheshes that says that there is never a kinyan. We then have the shita of Rav Huna who says, we have the shita, one more time. We have Rav Sheshes who says there's always a kinyan. We have Rav Huna who says there is never a kinyan. And then we have the middle level. We have Rav Nachman that he's mechalik. That if you're mezakeh loikana, but licha sheteled, there is yes a kinyan. 3-way machlokes. Says Rav Sheshes, I'll prove to you my shita that in all cases there is a kinyan. Rav Sheshes. Mina love murder. I know this Titania. Ger shemeis. If ger is nifter, ubizbuzu Yisrael nechasav. If after ger dies, Yisrael takes possession of the ger's belonging. Of course, the reason being that we know that a ger doesn't have any relatives from his prior life. Of course, if he has children after he's megayer, he does. But if he doesn't have any children from his prior life, so ger shemeis, and the Yisrael then comes and takes the initiative and grabs hold of his possessions. Vishamu, and subsequently they hear that sheyesh leiben, that indeed the ger has a child. Or the wife of the ger was me'uberes, was pregnant. The halacha is, it says the Brisa, chayavin lachzir. The Yisrael that grabbed hold of the possession is obligated to return the property, because now the property is not ownerless, because we have this child or this relative that will inherit him. Hechziru, if the Yisrael goes and returns hakol, everything, v'achar shamu, and then he hears shemeis binoi, that child died, oy shepilu ishtoi, or unfortunately the wife had a miscarriage. Hechzik b'shniya kana. Whoever takes possession at this point, b'shniya, at the second occasion, after the death, has a kinyan. Ubarishaina lo kana. But the original one, the one that took possession, the bizbizu, right after the ger died, he does not have a kinyan. So says Rav Sheshes, what do we see from over here? But if you think Ober loikano, if you are going to tell me I'm a zakal ober loikano, like for example Rav Huna holds, lamaluhu achzuki b'shniya. Why would anyone have to make a kinyan a second time? ha'achziku lehu chadazimna. You made the kinyan the first time. So says Rav Sheishes, must be that the Ober indeed has a kinyan. Amar Abaye. Abaye comes along and Abaye says this is not a raya to your classical Mizakal Ober. Why? Yerusha Bamele Hashayni. Says Abaye, a Yerusha which comes automatically is different. And this we had this in yesterday's daf as well. And the reason being that even if generally we would say like Rav Sheshes Zakal Ober Kana, that does not prove that if you're giving something would be different. So we don't have a raya from Zakal Ober to Yerusha Abba Me'aleha. Says the Gemara, Rava Amar. Rava comes along, and Rava explains another reason why there's no raya. Shiny Hasam derapoy marpian biyadayu. Says Rava meikara. Originally, in the case of the ger, it was very weak in his hands, and therefore maybe in that case, bidavka is a kinyan. But says Rava, that's not a raya to our classical case of mizakal ober. Says the Gemara, Mai Beinayu. What is the practical difference between these two terutzim of Abaye and Rava? Beinayu, sheshamu boy shemes, v'loy mes, v'achar kach mes. The difference is going to be where they heard that the fetus, that the Ober died. The truth, the Ober did not die at that moment, only died subsequently. That will be a case that we'll see a chilik between the two terutzim of Abaye and Rava. We'll let the Rashbam for a moment explain the chilik. Says Rashbam, first of all, again, my beinayo in the Baila Rava. Says Rashbam, we're middle of the medium-sized lines, about 20 lines down in the Rashbam. The Rashbam explains the Shonish Ram Shamati, v'lo yashu be'inai. Rashbam says, I heard many Lashainas how to explain this, but it's not clear, it's not straight in my eyes. Amnam, Kain Sarch Lefarish. This is how you have to explain the Gemara. Ike be'inayu be'in l'bayil l'rava b'chai gavna. Ger shemeis u'b'zi Yisrael nechasef. The ger dies and Yisrael grabs all of his properties. V'chziku and takes possession. V'achashamu she'eshtay mu'beres. Then he hears that the wife was mu'beres. V'shamu achar kein shemeis ober. And then he hears that the ober died. V'adayin ahayu muchzakin. And at that moment, this third party Yisrael is still muchzak in the properties. Inami. Or maybe after he heard that the baby died, he grabbed hold of the properties. But he didn't really die. So which is basically happening over here, there's a kinyan, there's a chazaka happening at a potential thought that there's no ober, but there really is. But he died afterwards. So Leah Baye Damar Ober Yairish Bishop Yerusha Me'aleha. According to Abaye, what was the chilik? That the reason why the Ober inherits because the Yerusha that comes from somewhere else, and that's the chilik between that and Mizakil Ober. Hamachzikim Rishayna Kaidemi says Ober, the first one that makes the chazak before the Ober actually died. Lo yechziku elo machziki achar misasi. Only the other ones. But and of course, in the contrast, we'll have clarity. The time of Birapuye Machzikim Rishayna. The time of Birapuye. Rava says that the reason is that the case of the ger is a case where there's an uncertain hold at the beginning. The first people that took hold and they heard that he died. Their chazaka is yes a chazaka. And even though it wasn't actually true, in their hands it wasn't weak, it was weak in the hands of the ger, because since they heard that the baby actually died, it's only going to have the actual chazaka when it goes into the world. And that's how the Rashbam explains a little bit of a complicated pshat, but that is the Rashbam explaining the chilik between Abaye and Rava. Continues the Gemara asking Kashan Rav Sheshes again. Rav Sheshes holding Hamazakil Obar. Whether you said it's tam, whether you said Lechshateleid, both of them are working. Tashema. The Gemara has a kasha. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam she'akol 5 lines from the bottom. Ta shema tinok. Excuse me. Ta shema tinok ben yoimai. We have a baby. Tinok ben yoim echad noichel umanchil. Could inherit and could bequeath. What's the implication of this Mishnah? Ben yoimai echad. Only if the baby is 1 day old, then yes, that baby is noichel and manchil. So the clear implication is the baby has to live for a day. Whereas Ober Loi, a clear kasha on Rav Sheshes, answers the Gemara 3 lines from the bottom. Ha'amar Rav Sheshes, noichel b'nechse'im lahanchel la'achem minav. Rav Sheshes explains that the Mishnah here is not referring to a regular noichel u'manchel, but rather the Mishnah over here is referring to being noichel from the mother to be manchel to brothers from the father. V'davka ben yom echad, that's where Rav Sheshes holds. It's davka ben yom echad, aval obar loy. My taima. Why would this be a chilek in this case? B'davka, as we turn over to Kof ben Beis Amid Aleph, explains the Gemara, Dave Mayis Bereisha. The reason is Rav Sheshes holds an interesting scientific chilek that when unfortunately a woman dies in childbirth, the fetus, the ober, dies first. And because the woman dies first, therefore the ben does not inherit his mother when in the grave. To give to the brothers from the father. And therefore, it's only going to be, that's only if the ben was alive. But if we say that the Ober dies first, then the Ober never had a moment that he inherited. And since the Ober never had a moment that he inherited, that's why the Ober can't give it over to the brothers from the father. If the Ober would inherit, then he would. But over here, because the Ober died and then the mother died, so there never was a moment that the Ober was able to be lahanchalachem in av. But it's davka klape this din of lahanchalachem in av. But says Rav Sheshes, this is not going to be a kasha on me, because I still could hold that ostensibly hamazakul over is kana. Says the Gemara, lemeimra, this is to say, dhumais bereisha. Are you implying, are you telling me that the Ober dies first? Avi obda upirchas tulasa berchusi. But as the Gemara, there was a story. A pregnant woman died, and then after the death, the fetus was moving around for 3 times, clearly showing us, asks the Gemara, that the fetus is alive even after the mother is nifteres. Amar Mar bar Avashi, explains Mar bar Avashi, Midi dehave aznav hatla, says Mar bar Avashi, the fetus moving around doesn't show anything. Just like the tail of a lizard, that after it's cut off, the lizard still moves around, but doesn't show that there's actually life. Says the Gemara. Now we bring another way of explaining to be a raya to Rav Sheshes that Ober could yes have a kinyan. Mar Breder Rav Yosef Mishvei Rava Mar Loimar. Mar Breder Rav Yosef Mishvei Rava Mar Loimar. 1 second, we lost a place. Loimar Shemayid V'Chelik B'Chayra. The Mishnah means when it says that to lahanchalachem achem and ahav, what it means is that he's mimayit, he reduces the chilek of the b'chayra. V'davka, that's when it has to be a tinok ben yoim echad to mimayit in the chilek b'chayra. Aval, however, ober loy. But in the case of a regular ober, then it will not diminish in the b'chayra. My time, what's the reason? V'yoldu loy amar rachmana. Says the Torah, v'klape bechar, that when it's born to him, says the Torah, Amar Mar bar Breder Rav Yosef Shvei Rav Ben Shen Noilad. We're about 12 lines from the top of Kof Men Beis and Mid Beis. The first one line is Shen Noilad. Ben Shen Noilad, a baby that's born. Lacham, he says Aviv. After the father dies, of course, he doesn't diminish the chilik b'chayra because he wasn't alive when the father died. My time, what's the reason? Says the Torah has to be born to him. And such a baby was not. So when the Mishnah that we quoted at the bottom of Amar Aleph that said only a ben yoim echad has this din that is not going to transfer over l'anchal la'achim and av, says the Gemara, this is referring to not that an Ober won't have a kinyan. Ober, will have a kinyan like Rav Sheshes. What's it referring to? It's referring to a different din. It's referring to a din of mimayet, the chelet b'chayru, which the Gemara proves from the pasuk of v'lo yaldu loy. Says the Gemara, Basura masni yachi b'mdisa masni yachi. That's how they learned in Surah. And b'mdisa they learn a little different. Amar Rav Yosef Mishvei Derav. A bachar that is born after Misas Aviv, a person dies, his wife being pregnant with their first child, and she gives birth to twin boys. The question is there a din of a bachar? Says the Gemara, no, because they were born la'achar Misas Aviv. The other case Rashbam says they could be referring to is if he leaves behind two pregnant wives and each bore a son after the husband was no longer, and again, they will not have a din of a bachar because they were not born in the lifetime of the father. My taima, what's the reason? So the Gemara is a slightly different drasha. Yakir Amar Rachmana v'alasa Yakir. In this case, there's no such din of Yakir of recognizing because the father is no longer. And the Gemara concludes, as often does, we paskin like all these Lashaines that were said over B'Shem Rava, that what a baby born Lachamisas Aviv does not get Pishnayim. Also, a baby born Lachamisas Aviv will not be Mimayit in the Chilek of the Bechayra. Says the Gemara, continuing in our sugya of Mezakah La'ober, at what level a fetus could have a kinyan. Amar Rav Yitzchak Amar Rav Yechanan. Smack in middle of the Amid. First one in line is Amar HaMezakeh La'ober Loi Kana. Not like Rav Sheshes. Rav Yitzchak says the name of Rav Yechanan, there is no kinyan. Vim Taimar, and if you're going to ask Mishnah Seinu, what about our Mishnah, which seems to indicate back in Daf Kov Mem Beis that a Ober can yes have a kinyan? Says the Gemara, that Mishnah is no raya. Why? Since one's das is close to his son, that is the reason why there would be a giving over to this child, even though he's not ba'ilam. That's only going to be that specific case, but not a regular case of Mizakal Ober. Go out, go out and find me 10 people. And for what reason? And I'm going to tell in front of them, I'm Zakal Ober Kana. And I'm going to say over the din, over the halacha for the future, that what? To publicize Zakal Ober Kana. Concludes the Gemara v'Hilchasa Zakal Ober Loi Kana. L'maisa we're paskening not like Rav Sheshes that there will not be a kinyan. And we'll end off the day with one more story. There were some that said this, why if Nechasei Levini Dahavi Liminach, my Nechasim should be to the children that I will have from you as a break Shisha. The older son that from a different wife came, Amar Leahu Gavra, and he said, my Amar Leahu Gavra, my Tevi Alei. And he said, what will be of that person? What will be of me? He asked. If you're giving everything away to this other woman's children, what about me? Amar Lei, the father said, Zil Kini, go and inquire, Kechad mi bara. Go and make a kini like one of the sons, and you will indeed get a share. Says the Gemara, Hanach vade loikana dekad lesnai. These other children from the second wife certainly don't have a kinyan yet. Why? Because they're not yet ba'ilam. Hi, this son who is in the ilam is chaylik l'talya b'makayim b'naya. This son from the first wife does have a portion with the other children. Oy lesle chaylik l'talya b'makayim b'naya. Or maybe not. Or maybe he does not have a portion with the other son. So ask the Gemara fundamentally, when the father tells his original son, yeah, go make a kinyan with them, does that work or not? Says the Gemara to Machlekes. Rav Avin, Rav Miashia, Rav Yirmiyah, Damri is chelik l'tali makabanaya. He will have a chelik, or Rav Rachanina bar Ababi, everything nafcha Damri les chelik l'tali makabanaya, that he will not have a chelik. Amar le Rav Avua le Rav Yirmiyah hilchos lekavosan, hilchos lekavasayu. What is the halacha? Like the first group of Amoraim and the second group of Amoraim. Amar le pshita. It is pashet, we're 5 lines from the bottom, the kavasan, that the halacha is like us, the kishishnu minaychu, for the simple reason that we are older than you, because you are younger than us. Amar le, so Ravu is not happy. What does that have to do with age? Why is that a reason? V'taima Talia Milsa. V'taima mai. So if Yirmiyah said, so what's the reason? Go to Rav Avin, Laelihu. Rav Avin will explain what's going on. We'll have the next Amud. Let's just read another few words. V'karkish be'rishe be'midrash on the top of Kumem Gimel Amud Aleph. He nodded and he went to the base medrash. Azul Gabaya Rimir went to Rav Avin. Amar le ilu Amar le kni kichamar mikani. The father would have told the older son, go acquire like a donkey. Would that have worked? Of course not. Just like the donkey doesn't have a kinyan, so to you and not. So in this case, when he said, go make a kinyan like the children are not born, as well, he does not have a kinyan. But if he says, okay, we'll stop over here because this goes well into the next Amud, B'siyata Dishmaya.